I'm sure you will have seen that a couple of weeks ago an employee from Verizon was outed as having outsourced his own job, which for those of you who haven't, I'm pretty sure most of you know, but those who haven't, he was sitting at home fiddling around his computer and watching, viewing photos, having outsourced his role for around about a fifth of his salary to a team in China, whilst having consistently the highest quality scores of anyone in his team. Right. So, first conclusion is all over the country, CFOs are sitting there going, right, outsourcing works. Second conclusion, the guy's a genius, but he's obviously not that much of a genius because he got caught. But the fact that he could have got away with that so much is dependent upon the fact that the quality was that high. And I think the implications of that, well, the implications for him are pretty negative, obviously, but the implications generally are pretty stark. Verizon's now got to deal with its shareholders who are saying, well, why aren't you outsourcing everyone? Because if you're paying 5 times as much to everyone for delivering worse work than that man is delivering you, and the reason he's been fired wasn't because of the problem with his work, it's because of his complete and utter shameless
entrepreneur.
Yeah, well, yes. I mean, give the guy a medal and then sack him, obviously. But, why aren't you outsourcing? Why are you not outsourcing your entire staff doing those roles and any other? Obviously, for the outsourcing industry, for Chinese suppliers in particular, but also generally, this is amazing PR. For Verizon, it's not. But that question needs to be asked: why are you retaining that staff if it's been demonstrated that they're not as good as people who are costing a fifth of the price? Now we've been aware that this is an advantage, or the great advantage of outsourcing for many years. People who know outsourcing appreciate the pros and the cons, but are aware that you can deliver good work, not necessarily the best work, but good work at a fraction of the cost. When you start looking at the advantages that are going to be delivered by the robotics that I was talking about earlier, that becomes, the cost savings become truly astronomical, and the work will be 24/7, and it will be to a much higher quality eventually than any human FTE. So you've pretty much got a case signed, sealed, delivered for outsourcing from the perspective of the company, and that tends to be where the conversation stops. Certainly, as far as Outsource Magazine is concerned, we're not here to investigate the social consequences of outsourcing so much as to tell people how to outsource better. We're a thought leadership channel, but it doesn't mean we don't have to think about it. And I want to know how you guys feel about those jobs that are being lost. And I want to know how you guys feel about what it will mean for an economy when we have the service jobs that we've embraced as a society, being more or less happy with offshoring our manufacturing base. What it means when those service jobs are going to be able to be done either offshore totally or by robots totally, or at least to a great extent. And I think that's actually quite a terrifying prospect. And I think it's the sort of question that is discussed by people in pubs and in living rooms around the country, but isn't necessarily discussed with any degree of honesty by the likes of us, because it's easier not to. And I don't think there are any easy answers, actually. I think you can turn around and say, well, the inexorable tide of business development and the inexorable tide of technology will result in robots doing all the work, or at least in the meantime, much cheaper offshore FTEs doing all the work, or fewer people doing more work for less money. And that's true. Is that a bad thing? Well, not. It's not for the shareholders in the short term. Of course it's not. It's not for the people who are incentivized to cut costs quarter on quarter. It's pretty rubbish for the people whose jobs are lost, but we have to be relatively Darwinist about it, don't we? And say, well, your job is not necessary. It's not necessary for us to be paying that guy at Verizon 5 times what his worse work is worth. And that actually tends to be as far as the conversation goes. And there's a certain logic to that, because actually that's as far as the conversation goes with regard to the bottom line every quarter and every annual statement. You guys, and to a certain extent myself, I mean, I'm not looking forward to my role being outsourced to a robot, but it probably will happen eventually. By which point, obviously, I've made my millions. But those conversations, they do tend to stop before you get to the. I'm not so concerned about the moral implication, because I think that's a conversation philosophers can have for the rest of eternity. But it's the social implication and actually the implication for business after a big cycle of worry and despair, which I think is interesting. And the reason I want to talk about this is because I think it's fascinating that in the short term, technology can save money, reduce headcount, it can open up all sorts of new roles, but in the long term, it might be actually taking away the consumer base upon which most companies rely for their income. We certainly require investment from advertisers, from sponsors. My MD runs another few magazines, they're mostly consumer focused. I put bread on my table through people spending money. What happens when the number of people who have money to spend is not sufficient to carry the weight of what we're doing? And actually, I believe we might have reached that point already. These dates are probably going to be wrong, but between the advent of Margaret Thatcher as Prime Minister and the end of Tony Blair's Prime Ministership, net, the private sector did not create any jobs north of Watford Gap. It was the public sector that was sustaining them. Yet it's the public sector that's being vilified right now. It's the public sector that's taking the brunt of the cuts. The argument is that the private sector is going to be the wealth creator and is going to be the saviour of Britain. And actually that has not been the case. Generally, where the investment has come from, where the jobs have come from, have been through the public sector sustaining an unsustainable society. And unfortunately for people in our business, we have to take a share of responsibility for that. Now, is that a bad thing? It's not a bad thing. It's the way of the world. But the only reason it is the way of the world is because there's no overarching concern beyond the bottom line, which is then applicable to society as a whole. Now, the reason I'm talking to you about this is probably because I'm concerned about it as a father, as a taxpayer, but as editor of Outsource magazine. Because I believe outsourcing is a force for good in many ways. One of my writers, Martin Conboy, who is the president of the Australian Business Process Association, wrote an article last week which has been one of our most successful in the short term. It's outsourcing makes the world a better place. And it has done. I genuinely believe that. Outsourcing has given millions of people lives across impoverished countries which they wouldn't have had otherwise. Outsourcing has improved and created roles here in the UK. But it's also cost a lot of people jobs. And we as a society don't have an answer to that. People are being left behind. So what's the solution for business? Well, you can say it's nothing to do with business. You can say that business has no responsibility. You have responsibilities to your shareholders, and that's pretty much it. And that is what we've said for the last few decades, and that's to a certain extent fine. But I think it's increasingly visible that it's not fine if we're relying more and more on money that isn't there, and our businesses are relying more and more from investment, from sovereign wealth funds and from overseas companies that simply see an opportunity here where there isn't any actual cash left in Britain. I mean, that's a little bit of an exaggeration, but generally speaking, we don't have a lot of money left. And part of the reason is because the people who we rely on to be purchasing our goods and sustaining ourselves don't have any money. We as a society are effectively subsidising most of the UK. So maybe we need to think about what we're going to do with that. Are we going to just carry on as companies cutting jobs and cutting costs and delivering that value to shareholders, with the potential outcome down the line, by the time my daughter looks to have her own children, of there being an insufficient consumer base to fund us? I don't necessarily have the answer to that question, of course, but I think that question is something that we all really need to think about and we need to address, and it's something that I believe the outsource community maybe has a responsibility to help come up with the answers to, and hopefully we can have that debate over the next few months and years. Thank you very much.